5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, ignition, liftoff.
You're listening to Relentless. This is the show for high performers who are driven and committed to being at their best. Nick Peterson and Jonathan Montgomery, co-founders of Relentless Dietetics, are your hosts.
Welcome to the Relentless Podcast. I'm Nick Peterson, hanging out today again with Jonathan Montgomery.
What is up?
And Dr. Trevor Cashy.
Hello.
There he is. As per usual, we're here to discuss just getting a little bit better every day. As you know by now, if you've heard our previous episodes, we've recorded this in a very specific order. Our last episode, we talked about sequential thinking, which is just thinking about what is the right thing to do at the right time, right? Thinking in sequence and having a process in place. And the episode before that, episode 1, our very first, we talk about asking the right questions in order to maximize clarity, value, and effectiveness. Now, life, as volatile as it is, things are always in flux. It's really, really hard to nail down and figure out what is the right question to ask and what is the right step to take at this time. And the question is, I'm gonna ask Jonathan here, how do we know what the right thing at the right time is? And how do we know which question to ask?
You know, as far as questions go, this is actually a pretty great one. When it comes to what's right, well, how are you attempting to gauge what's right? Are you taking any measurements? Are you collecting any information? Are you analyzing any feedback? Or are you just winging it and going, all willy-nilly with the breeze? One of the best ways to get a definitive answer to any question is to simply start by taking a measurement. What can be measured can be managed. If you're not measuring, you're just guessing, and that's really not the way to ask the right question, in my opinion.
One of the many things I've learned from Trevor here is that taking a measurement and especially averaging it out over time and learning that skill set, what to measure and how to track it over time, is remove the emotional responses that are a result of the acute volatility of life, right? Things are good, they're bad, they're good, they're bad. And those emotional responses to those day-to-day things are never the best responses.
Yeah, I really couldn't agree more, man. Having the objective information collected over time is going to beat, an impulsive and subjective decision 99 times out of 100. When it comes to just making the right decisions, when you're looking for a predictable outcome. Guessing is not going to be ideal when you're hoping to achieve, measurable and quantifiable progress. It's just not going to work for you.
Right. And you're stuck, especially when you're guessing what noise is to be ignored and what is a signal to be acted upon. And you have to have some sort of process, right? Like some sort of trending data or some sort of measurement that helps you determine whether, hey, I need to react to this noise, or hey, I need to ignore this, whatever's going on. And I think over time, that's what we call intuition, right? You see the same thing over and over again. It becomes kind of a natural thing. And intuition is developed by ultimately measuring and managing and understanding these trends in reality over time.
Yeah, we see this quite a bit, lately, and there's this bit of a pushback against quantifying intake or tracking information in our business with a resurgence of what people are referring to as, intuitive eating. And this isn't surprising at all. Trends change, fads come and go, but the facts remain the facts, and calories do count, whether you are counting them or not. So you might as well get ahead of it and manage them. But what stands out to me here when it comes to this concept of intuition, especially when it comes to eating or anything really, is all of the people claiming to have success with this all come from years with a background in dieting history, either through extreme restrictions of food choices, eating typical bro foods, very clean eating, or fastidious tracking, measuring, and managing. You simply don't develop the ability to eyeball food and know what an ideal portion size for you on the third Tuesday of the month is by feel. You do it with a scale. It's not necessarily intuitive for them as much as it is simply falling back on habits obtained through years of objective feedback and structured programming. You learn to identify with what has provided a positive result in the past and gravitate towards it when looking for a similar result in the future. This to me is practice, and it's not intuition. And the most efficient practice is that which can be measured, adjusted, calibrated, and fine-tuned over time. And the best way to do that, I think, is by taking effective measurements.
You may not believe in calories, but they believe in you.
Absolutely.
Bingo.
And Trevor, man, I know you have some pretty interesting thoughts on people's ability to intuitively eat. I know we're kind of focusing on nutrition right now, but what do you think about that? When people intuitively eat, what kind of results are they going to get?
So here's a couple of things I noticed in the context of intuitive eating. You guys have brought it up pretty squarely here. And one is in the context of coaching or shilling the intuitive eating concept. And one is that if you are an intuitive eater, you have been your whole life and have never dieted and have never needed to diet and or never had the urge to diet. And if you are an intuitive eater or claim to be an intuitive eater and shill that as a method for progressing yourself physically or athletically, then, like you said, chances are you have a background of more formalized dieting where there are measurements being taken and you have learned how to take measurements. And the thing that's interesting to me is that whether you're using your eyeballs or your palm or a scale, it is all a measuring device. The difference is the accuracy of the measuring device you are using. So intuitive eaters are still making measurements. They are just not as accurate as the measurements as we use. And I would prefer to make an accurate measurement than an imprecise one.
And I think another point you brought out is somebody who's been auto-regulating their entire life and intuitively eating, and having success with it probably is not going to achieve the outlier status that most people are looking for. If you're intuitively eating to the way you're genetically predisposed based on feel, you're going to get your genetically predisposed average body composition. And I think most people aren't really looking for average when they're looking to make changes.
Well, that and you really have no business teaching something that you never had to learn. I think also makes a difference because there are freaks out there. That's fine. Some people have massive success despite the methods they use, not because of them. Intuitive eating functionally is pretty great if you want to maintain what you have, but you will not progress using it because the adjustments you have to make are within the margin of error that intuitive eating allows.
What can be measured can be managed.
And you don't have a right to teach something you have not had to learn yourself. That might be my favorite line so far.
If you're ready to get the body you desire without depriving yourself of the foods you enjoy, download your free diet playbook now at www.relentlesspodcast.com.
I would venture to say, because I've seen both of you go through it, that a lot of this is an art, right? There's a science and there's the art of whatever their, business, food, whatever. Trevor, how much do you think doing the science makes you better at the art? Or are you just born one way or the other with the ability to do the art without the science?
To be completely honest, I think you can do the art without any science at all. It's just a huge amount of trial and error, which ironically enough can be considered science depending on the frame of reference you're looking through. But you don't need to learn how the pancreas works to instill good habits. So what we want to do is combine a lot of basic fundamental science concepts that allow us to use inductive reasoning rather than deductive reasoning. So we have a basic concept of how the body works. We can apply that to less specific situations that give us a baseline in which to act upon. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and if I'm understanding correctly, then the measurements taken will help you refine the art, right? The measurements over time will help you become more intuitive as a coach or an athlete.
That is correct. So the science process is rather like there are decision trees, right? We do know if X happens and we should probably do Y, all right? But the art part of this has to do with the individual because we know what the perfect plan is. Right? The Russians figured out how to build muscle and lose fat 100 years ago. That is no secret. The issue or the art part of this process is how do we take that process and apply it to somebody who's not living in the Russian bubble? And how do you take something that we know how to apply if you do live in a vacuum, but you aren't living in a vacuum? And I think that's where the art part comes in.
Right. And so, Jonathan, the number of people that you guys run through RD, how are you determining this? What measurements are the biggest, highest leverage, biggest impact that people need in order to just get some sort of control?
You know, man, I think the biggest thing that people need to understand when it comes to food and it comes to progress, it's much like any other long-term endeavor, and that is the benefit of the time-weighted average, period. The average over time is going to tell you the truth of the matter. It's going to tell you what your success rate is, and it's going to tell you the efficacy of the program you're using. And for us, one thing specific that's huge for this are daily weigh-ins. Dr. Kashi, Trevor likes to always say, when it comes to collecting information, that 1 sets a point, 2 is a line, 3 you start developing a trend. By collecting multiple points of information, patterns and subsequent trends can be established, and we can actually see the direction you're heading in. A practical application of this is there's no reason to freak out because the scale jumped up a half a pound on Monday, when over the course of that week, of those 7 days, you average the loss of 1 pound. So many factors can come into that, from stress to food choice to sleep to the fact that it's Monday, that renders that kind of spike irrelevant. But you wouldn't realize that if you only weighed in that day or that week. The more measurements you take, the more information you have to analyze and make decisions from. This tends to let those anomalies and outliers factor out and expose the actual course and direction over time, which is going to allow in turn for much more accurate and purposeful adjustments. So many factors go into this, but the key underlying principle for all of them is using objective information gathered through quantifiable metrics to either confirm or deny, your subjective feels, and then adjust accordingly. Maybe you're feeling, one way, you're feeling heavy, but your trending shows you're down. Maybe you're feeling flat, but your photos show you're vascular and full. Feels can be indicative of progress, but they can also mask the truth. And that's why we want measurements to confirm feelings. And honestly, by having those measurements over time, that's how you develop intuition to trust your feelings. Or in my case, for instance, completely negate them altogether and not worry about them. I just listen to what Trevor tells me. Another reason for this, and maybe something we'll touch on a bit more in depth in a future podcast, but, repeated measurements like daily weigh-ins, they also help expose patterns. They predict future responses in similar situations, and they sort of kind of inoculate you to the volatile nature of life day to day and strengthen your resolve to stay the course, which is all good stuff. It may not be exactly, falling under the concept of, what can be measured can be managed, but the benefit you receive from no longer fearing those things and trusting your measurements, you can't really put a price on that.
I mean, we see it in business, right? We have conversations where it's like, oh my gosh, this feels like we're spending too much money on advertising, or we're not signing up enough people. And it's always, well, let's look at the data, right? Let's look at the data. Let's look at last month. And as we've grown and as we've gotten better at this whole business thing, our measurements have become more precise. And as a result, our intuition, so to speak, has improved. Trevor, what do you think is the importance of how precise do measurements need to be?
This is like the protein question that the other podcast lady asked me before.
I felt it coming.
Between the difference between precision and accuracy, which is a lot of people have no idea. As well, they shouldn't, because there's really no reason to unless you're a weirdo like me. So there's 2 different aspects to this question, which I think have a little bit of weight here. So precision of a measurement typically has to do with, if I take this measurement 3 times, do I get the same answer 3 times? But that same answer 3 times can still be the wrong answer. So is your measurement accurate, and is it precise? So if you take 3 measurements and it's 3 different numbers, then one of those numbers may be accurate, but since they're 3 different numbers, it is no longer precise. And this is where the averages over time becomes important, because a biological system runs on a continuum. And as far as how precise you want your measurements to be, To use the question you're asking me a little more literally, you want them to be as precise as humanly possible. Ideally, you want the same measurement to be the same way every single time, but it never is. And that's not necessarily bad. What it does is it gives you information to help you regulate your behavior to make your measurements consistent. You'll never actually get 100% consistent, but you'll get damn close.
And there you have it from the scientist himself. In short, if you're not taking measurements, you're guessing. And if you're guessing, you can't really expect to make much progress. And as far as the efficacy and precision of those measurements, we will talk about that next time.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.